like we're talking about all these like ads, like you'll see somebody who like bought Soothe because they saw
Yeah.
an ad, but the signal running into Soothe is like 60 dB in the red. It's like Soothe can't do its best job when it's being fed signals like that. So it's really just educating them on why it matters and how to keep track of the gains and stuff.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Merry Christmas, folks, and welcome to the Inside the Mix podcast. Ho, ho, ho. It is December the 24th, 2024, and I hope you are gearing up for an amazing Christmas. I know I am for certain. So, a big welcome to the new listeners. Make sure you hit follow on your podcast player of choice. And if you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you get notified of new episodes. And to the returning listeners, as always, a huge welcome back. This episode is a rerun. I don't do this often, but it is December the 24th. And this episode is the most popular episode of 2024. So a huge thank you to everybody who's listened and supported the podcast this year. I've spoken to some amazing people, made some great friends, both on the podcast and you, the listeners, as well. So huge thank you to everyone. I can't wait to see what 2025 brings as well. Get my words wrong here. I'm too excited for Christmas. I love the festive season. Anyway, this is episode 143, and it dropped in the spring of 2024. And it's my discussion with mastering engineer Eric Mitchell, and it's titled The Art of DIY Mastering, Tips and Strategies to Master Your Own Music. In this episode, we discuss DIY mastering and home studio limitations, the evolution of mastering techniques, which DAW is best for mastering, the purpose of a reference track, the benefits of gain staging, and then mastering and workflow advice for you folks. So without further ado, let's dive into my chat with Eric Mitchell of Eric Mitchell Audio, and have a great Christmas and a Happy New Year when it arrives, folks. Hey folks, in this episode, I'm very excited to welcome my guest today, the brains behind Eric Mitchell Audio from Connecticut, Eric Mitchell. Hi Eric, how are you? And thanks for joining me today.
Good, how are you, man? Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm good. I was just saying off air that I've got a toasted face, haven't been sunburnt, but apart from that, I'm doing all right. I thought I might get struck by some sort of like heat stroke or something, but thankfully I didn't, you know. But apart from that, I'm good. Yeah. So we were chatting off air that we actually put this in the calendar about 6+ months ago. So it's I've been excited to chat with you about all things mastering. It's a nice topic, as it always is, mastering, but it fits in nicely to the sort of curated episodes I've put together recently. I've had numerous mastering engineers, more this year than any other year in this sequence of episodes, so it's really, really cool. So I'm just going to read a bit from your bio for the audience who might not be familiar with yourself. So, contrary to a large portion of the people with careers in the industry who tend to specialize in one area, Eric has all the bases covered, equally skilled across the board with a well-seasoned history of success to back it up: songwriting, music production, tracking, mixing, mastering, live sound, commercial audio, et al. So the largest portion of Eric's clients are electronic artists and labels. And if any listeners are fans of Glassjaw, I remember listening to Glassjaw when I was going through my sort of metal stage. I still am, to be honest. Eric's been responsible for how they sound live since 2018, and he's also remastered the 20th anniversary vinyl box set. That's so cool. In addition to the aforementioned, Eric's also educates through production, songwriting, and DAW lessons, workshops, in person and remotely. And in this episode, we're going to be unlocking the secrets to preparing mixes for mastering and just general mastering how-to, DIY in particular. So I thought, Eric, it'd be quite cool if you could talk a bit about DIY mastery. Can artists, this is quite a divisive question, can artists achieve good results mastering their music in a home studio environment? Maybe if you could talk about some limitations versus working with a professional mastering engineer. What are your thoughts?
Sure. I think, the short answer is yes, I think it's possible for artists to master their own music. But I think the most important tool there, which most people don't focus enough on, is just the ears. And I think that's the biggest difference you get between like a DIY master that somebody is just kind of deciding to do themselves versus somebody who is actually traveled the path to put the time in with their ears to be one.
Yeah.
And with that also comes with a lot of the things that you learn once you put that ear time in, like having the room tuned and set up a certain way so that your response and everything is what you expect. And I just see a lot of people who do want to do this themselves, like they seem to be looking for that like silver bullet plugin, or they spend a lot on plugins because they're falling victim to like all the marketing now, like this one plugin is what you need for the best master on the planet, and all those Instagram ads we get all the time, and so I really just think the biggest gap there is just like that experience and the time, between somebody who's, they say 10,000 hours plus you need to be a pro or whatever.
Yeah.
So that being said, I think people can definitely do it themselves, but you have to, or at least for me, when I first started doing this, because it wasn't even intentional, was like realizing just how much time that 10,000 hours is, and like how much sacrifice in your life and everything that you kind of have to put in to be able to afford yourself that, putting that time into to train your ears and everything. So I would just say, people that do want to do it themselves, don't be looking for the silver bullet plugin. You should be able to do a good master with stock DAW plugins at the end of the day, and just be putting your time in however you want to do that, whether it's your own stuff, mastering for your friends, for practice, whatever. There's lots of services online where they'll give you a project or something to test master. You just need the time with the ears. So yeah.
10,000 hours. That's the same with any sort of discipline, isn't it? You sort of need to put in those 10,000 hours, and it sounds like a lot, but you have to do it. It's like exercising that creative muscle, and like the more you do it, the better you're going to get. And I think ears are focus. I've written that here in my notes as you were talking there. Is really, really important. And the silver bullet you mentioned as well, because like you say, you get bombarded with emails. You go on YouTube and like the algorithm is what it is, and then you just every advert is just, oh man, you need this plugin. This sounds so good, I just my head in my hands every time I see it. It's like every time it's like, oh, this is the best thing ever, and it's just like you're not well, I guess you are. Yeah, otherwise they wouldn't do it in a way. But you're kind of like, I don't know. It's just, it doesn't seem to me like that it's really gonna be of that benefit if everybody is saying like this is the silver bullet, not just in mastering, but music production in general.
Period.
Like, creating a chord progression, this will do it for you. This will create the beat for you. This will mix it for you. This will improve the low end. It's just like, I can tell. I could just go on a rant for about an hour about that in its own right, but I won't because the listeners will get a bit bored of me doing that. But I got a question off the back of what you said there about the room being tuned, which is really, really important. When you were starting out in this mastering game, what was your first sort of focus that you really wanted to dial in? Was it like the listening and being able to critically listen and use your ears, or did you focus on getting the room right first? Which one would you do first?
Well, what I would do now is definitely like focus on the room, and like I made the mistake like a lot of people do, and at the start I didn't consider like my monitors in the room one thing. I was just thought of them as like the monitors in my room, but the monitors are what they are in that room. So it's kind of like the room and the speakers are one thing themselves, and you could go to a different room with the same speakers and you get a different response. So starting to consider the whole environment as one unit that needs to be considered, all those aspects together, and that's like speakers, conversion, and the room. I think of all that as one thing. When I started, it was just the ears, and so I was on like cheap speakers in an untreated room, and I was like doing the car tests after every master and all that kind of stuff, and thankfully car tests is like a distant memory, but and I guess that's another thing that's actually a good gauge. Is like if you, as an engineer, if you're still you got to do car tests after every mix and like check your stuff, I would say like that's an indicator that you're pretty far off from
Yeah.
like where your ears should be to be doing like professional work. Because there's never any question of what I'm hearing. It just goes straight to the client. There's never a car test.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I've had this conversation a few times now this year and the end of last year. Because once again, this goes back to a lot of the things you read online about how you test it in X, Y, Z scenario. And the feedback now that I'm hearing more and more of is like is trust what you're hearing out of your speakers. That's where you're working out most of the day, isn't it? So that's the platform you're listening on. And like when you send it to a client for them to audition, are you instructing them to listen to it on the playback medium they use the most, or do you tell them to listen to it on various different platforms?
I just send it. I don't even tell them what to listen. Like it's.
Okay.
I mean, it should. A good master should sound the way that it's intended, no matter what they're listening on. I mean, obviously, like laptop to something with sub bass will be a big difference, but generally speaking, the master should stand up to whatever. So I just send it and wait for the feedback.
Nice. A bit of a tangent here. So I asked you a question there about using your ears and the treatment of the room. Just like quickly, could you just tell our audience a bit? I mean, I should probably ask this right at the beginning. How did you get into mastering? What initially spurred you on to pursue it as your main focus?
It was necessity. What I say, like necessity is the mother of all invention. So it's like I was actually an artist first. I've been an artist since I was like a kid. I started playing guitar and everything in like hardcore metal bands.
Nice.
And at that time we paid other engineers to do everything for us. And towards the end of that, I started in our sessions with other engineers. They started letting me get like hands-on the boards. And like one of our albums we did was actually on the same console that Queen's record was recorded on, the old Flying Fader, like massive large format console.
Yeah.
That was pretty cool to get to be on that. But I went from that to electronic music and like heavy EDM electro, and this was like in I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 years ago when that EDM boom first really started to take off. And we did an album, and I was still working with like my rock engineer peers at the time, and so he referred us to go to a prominent mastering engineer that was out of Massachusetts. And so we went there, and this mastering session essentially led us to walking away with like a master that we weren't happy with. And it basically just, we couldn't get it, or the engineer couldn't get it loud enough, and he was kind of trying to steer us away from loudness, which for EDM you can't really do. And so long story short, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to have to just learn how to do this on my own, I guess, because most of the other mastering engineers at the time I were talking to were laughing at the kind of levels that we were trying to get to.
Yeah.
Which I know they're obscene, but, it's just par for the course with EDM. So I just forced myself there to start figuring out the mastering side, which with EDM and loudness, it's really kind of tied to the mix. It's like you can't take just any old mix and crank it to those levels via mastering.
Yeah.
And expect it to sound good. So like it kind of pushed me to evolve to this very peculiar system, which as far as I can tell, I don't think anybody else is working this way, and I'm not sure how you feel about it. This might be opening a can of worms, but I essentially I shouldn't say every single, like 95% of the work that I do for my clients, they're sending me their project file. Not a bounce, not stems, but their actual DAW project file.
Wow.
And I'm opening it natively, so I have a metric F ton of plugins to be able to open whatever anybody sends me, even if it's stuff that I don't use on my own,
Wow.
because I have to be able to open their project.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so the reason that I evolved to do this is because, like I said, especially with electronic music, it has to be so loud. The mix has to be engineered for that. And what was happening was most of the time, people's mixes were not appropriate for what they wanted in the end.
Yeah.
And, a lot of mastering engineers that will say to me, "Oh, you're not mastering, you're mixing, you're mixing and mastering," which might be partially true, but the thing I find interesting is that they'll say that doing that is a fault because I'm taking myself out of the mastering perspective and I'm going into the mixing perspective. But my argument for that and why ultimately this came to be more efficient for me is that if somebody sends me a stereo file and I open it and the mix isn't appropriate for what they're asking for, I now have to stop and ask the client, can you send me a new mix and can you do X, Y, Z? So now I'm stopping. I'm taking myself out of the moment where I just listened and it's fresh and I got to stop my flow and now I got to ask for stuff and hope they get it right when they send it back. And that to me was a very convoluted slowdown, which, you just sat down and you're ready to do this. And now you got to stop and ask for revisions. So ultimately I just started saying, send me your project file. And now when I open that project file, I hit spacebar and hit play. It's no different to my ears whether I'm listening to a stereo mix or stems or their project file. I'm still hearing the same thing the first time. It's just now I don't have to stop and ask for changes if I hear, oh, the kick low end is fighting the bass. I just fix it directly on those things, proceed with the master. I'm not stopping to mix or change the way the song sounds. It's a no compromise approach. Whereas, in a stereo master, oftentimes you have to compromise one thing to fix another because.
Yeah.
So this way, I'm not making any compromise. It's all fixed directly there, and I can engineer what's feeding the mastering for the loudness. So it kind of all goes hand in hand as one process for me.
Yeah. That's a really interesting workflow. I've not. That is, I mean, you must have quite the arsenal of plugins because I know there's a lot of people use different stuff. What about DAWs then? Does that mean are you open to any DAW submissions? So someone says you Logic, Ableton, Reason, Cubase, whatever it may be.
Yep,
so
I literally have them all.
Wow, you must be pretty au fait with all those different DAWs then.
Yeah, it forced me to get familiar with all of them. The one that I haven't got on board with is FL, but that one I just never. I don't know. I just never wanted to jump in there. So if someone's in FL, I haven't sent me stems, but even if they're not sending me a project file, most of the time it's at least stems. Maybe a half a dozen times a year I'm mastering a stereo mix.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting what you mentioned there about FL, because having chatted to a number of sort of artists who sort of move in that realm, they love FL, but I guess it depends on the individual, doesn't it? It's subjective ultimately.
Yeah, the few times I've been in it, it just how they all kind of things either click or don't.
Yeah.
Just the way that they, even Ableton at first, I guess I didn't like it. I called it unableton, which is actually I prefer Ableton actually for mastering. That's my DAW that I like to use. But FL for whatever reason, it just never clicked with me, and I was just like, we'll skip that one. But the other thing I forgot to say too is another reason why I really like doing that is because even if somebody sends me stems, a lot of time when people, even when I just go into their project or I'm listening to the stems, there's processing they've put on that's baked in, and so if it's a stem, I can't take it off. But if I'm in the project file, I can remove the bad processing directly.
Yeah.
If they high pass everything in the project, or you know what I mean, the weird isms you see when you're in there, and that stuff that I can avoid.
Yeah, I know what you mean when you look into a project and you see some very weird stuff.
Yeah,
what you mentioned there about high passing stuff. I see that a lot. Where people are high passing things, you're like, I'm not entirely sure why you've done that. Maybe I think I don't know, maybe it's a running theme for this episode, but again, it's things you see online and they've done as a result of like a TikTok or a real video. They're like, oh yeah, you got to do this so you can X, Y, Z.
Up your low end, put a high pass on every channel. Like,
yeah. Great. Now I've got
exactly
nothing in the mastering. I've got like, it's completely dead down there. Yeah, I know, it's interesting, that, isn't it? So with regards to that, then, like if they're sending you a mix and you're going in and you can alter these bits and pieces, are you having a conversation? Do you let them know beforehand before you master it? Because what if they were to turn around and say, well, that's my, I suppose it's devil's advocate. That's my creative vision there. I've put that there, excluding the high pass because that is what it is. But maybe something else. And they're like, oh no, I wanted that in there. That's what I wanted as part of the arrangement or my creative vision.
Right.
How's that conversation? And what does that entail?
Well, luckily I can't really think of any times. Well, maybe once or twice over like my whole time doing this, where somebody was like, "Oh, like this and that changed, and we need to get it back." But I think that's because usually I'm part of the process. So if it's a new client for the first time, I always have them send me 2 to 3 reference tracks. And something I also mentioned with them, which a lot of people I feel like don't talk about, especially for electronic music, is that the reference should be in the same key. Because if you, and this has come up a lot with people that use like, Ozone AI assisted mixing or whatever, these plugins that analyze and do stuff for you. If they're putting in a track for that plugin to reference and analyze in EQ match or whatever, and it's a different key, especially with electronic music because it's so sub bass centric. If you're listening to a track and the sub bass fundamental and this one's at 40 and the sub bass fundamental and this one's at 50, the EQ curves for those are going to look very different. So so I'll make sure that the references they're giving me are in the same key so that it's a apples to apples comparison. And so then from there, it's really just like, I guess, my experience in hearing the things that are congruent through their references, like what's the DNA of what they're going for, and then I just engineer their song into that vein.
Yeah.
So I guess it's kind of like a one-stop shop kind of approach. Like, you write the song and tell me what your intention was in the end, and then I'll make it match the intention. Yeah,
that's a really good one. I'd never, on hand on heart, I'd never considered actually saying make sure it's in the same key. And like audience listening, you're probably going to see that a lot now when this episode's released as like as an extraction from this episode on Instagram now when it comes to like top tip for this week's episode. I think that's amazing. As soon as you said make sure it's in the same key, my immediate thought was like fundamental frequencies, and I was like, of course, that makes like perfect sense. It makes total sense to do that. That's so good. I absolutely love that. Going back to DAWs, I do often go on tangents in this, because you've used so many, like for mastering, because you say you use Ableton primarily, right, for mastering.
Yep.
Would you say then, if you were to recommend a DAW for its native plugins for mastering, would you say Ableton would be your recommendation, or would it be another?
So my recommendation would be to use whichever one you find the most efficient and inspiring to you. I don't think the DAW matters. I just think, it's like a car. Every car will get you from A to B. It's just the experience while you're in there on that drive is different.
Yeah.
Some people want a Mercedes. Some people are fine with a Ford Focus. Like they're all fundamentally different. And so whichever one fits you best, you should run with that. The only caveat there is that figuring that out means you kind of got to give a little time to each one to give it a fair shot. And like I said, at first when I first learned, it was like on Pro Tools, Cakewalk.
Cakewalk, yeah.
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 Which turned into Sonar, and then I went from there to Reason. And so Ableton was like so foreign and like weird, and I hated it at first, but with EDM I had no choice. I had to be in there for clients. And so after I gave it time, all the things I hated about it and were like, why do they do it this way, I understand it because it was for workflow, and now that workflow is very efficient for me,
Yeah.
and I love it. So it's kind of like the song you listen to the first time you don't like, but you listen to it a bunch and it grows on you.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I did that with Logic because I primarily use Logic, and I went from Logic 9, and then I went to Pro Tools, and then I
Oh,
came back to Logic.
yeah,
I dabbled quite a bit with Ableton when I went through this phase of using Max MSP, and I was creating plugins and doing all
nice.
bits and pieces, man. And you could bring it into Ableton and create interfaces and stuff, and it was great.
Yeah.
And so it is a DAW that I'd like to extend more time to, because it does look good. But you mentioned Reason. Then did you use Reason prior to the because it's not always been accessible, well, you've not always been able to use third-party plugins in Reason.
Yes.
Did you use it before or after you were able to do that?
Before, and we were actually, I got endorsed by Propeller Heads.
Oh, nice.
So like we had a whole thing on their site and that was like the one you're talking about, the old one before they added the external plugin stuff. So I was using it for the EDM project I was in. Actually, we were writing all our music and mixing and mastering it in there. But they had like, I think they had just started doing those rack extensions. So it wasn't like you could just use VSTs, but you could buy like, they had that shop for rack extensions where some people made like plugins for it.
Yeah.
Nothing crazy though.
Yeah, I mean, I dabbled with it once again. It's like you said at the beginning. When I started out, I was trialing all these different DAWs, and this was around the time of when you can do that. I remember using Thor a lot. I mean, I really enjoyed using that. I remember I was also like the education side of things. I was teaching a class of these primary school kids how to use Reason, and I got my fingers burnt really quick there because this was before I knew anything about teaching. I was like, yeah, it'll be fine. I'll show them once and they'll get it. And like, no, not at all. As you probably know when it comes to teaching. But what you've mentioned there about like they're sending you projects, you're going in, you can do X, Y, Z in there before you get to the mastering phase. I thought it might be quite cool. I've got a question here with regards to what are the most frequent issues. So we mentioned about like the low pass and whatnot. What are the most frequent issues you encounter when mastering tracks that originated in sort of like home studio environments?
Number one, worst offender, I would say would be like gain staging. And by that, I don't mean, making sure that your master isn't over zero. I mean, that's an obvious one. But like, I'm just talking like channel to channel, plug in to plug in. A lot of times I'm seeing producers, they're just, they're writing electronic music or even metal and stuff, and they're just dragging in, drum samples or using like drum instruments and all this stuff in which the sound is already set up to be very loud or the samples are already at peak, and they're dragging them into their projects and they're leaving all the channels at zero. And so the master's in the red, and they just like throw a limiter or something on there and think, oh, I'm all set. My meter's not red anymore. It's like, well, it's not red there, but it's red in front of your limiter. You know what I mean? And so they don't understand the gain staging. And even, like we're talking about all these like ads, like you'll see somebody who like bought Soothe because they saw an ad, but the signal running into Soothe is like 60 dB in the red. It's like Soothe can't do its best job when it's being fed signals like that. So it's really just educating them on why it matters and how to keep track of the gains and stuff.
That's interesting you mentioned that about gain staging because I remember I saw this on TikTok and it was maybe this sort of time last year, and there's so many videos of people calling out other people for getting the definition of gain staging wrong. And it kind of alludes what you said there about like, because that's essentially what they were doing. But with regards to gain staging then, like what would your perfect description of it be? If you were to explain it to someone who is new to mixing production, what would your like sort of perfect definition of gain staging be?
Well, the way I like to do it is like when I'm writing is I just start, when I open up a project fresh to start, I just set it up right from the get-go to have a buffer. Like, so, typically if you bring in your kick to start or whatever, the loudest thing, I'll set that channel like minus 10 dB. And that's like my zero. So if I know that the kick is going to be the loudest thing and that's at minus 10, anything else shouldn't be going over that. And so, once all my channels are combining at the end, that usually gives me enough room I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, it needs to be 60 B under zero before you send me the master or whatever. I'm just like, as long as it's under zero and it's not clipping,
Yeah.
that's fine. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's especially fine because I'm going into the mix anyway and have the ability to fix the gain staging if it's wrong. But ultimately, yeah, it's just like make sure you just have the headroom. And, I find like the 10 dB down start point leaves enough headroom that by the end of a track, I'm where I should be.
Yeah, nice. That's good. I think that's a very, very good sort of tip to give out there with regards to, because I often get asked that questions like, where should I start? I mean, you don't. There's the top-down approach, isn't there? You can start with vocal and go the other way, but once again, I think depending on music might have an impact on that. So a nice little segue from sort of gain staging, and this comes down to sort of loudness, for want of a better way of putting it, and sort of clarity for streaming. So you mentioned there about EDM. And what would your advice be to someone who is sort of mastering their own music and they are obviously going to be releasing it on a streaming platform? Because there is the constant discussion online with regards to streaming platform and minus 14 laughs, blah, blah, blah. And the audience have probably heard that many a times now.
Yep.
What's your advice for someone who is doing it themselves with regards to sort of levels for streaming platforms?
Well, this is another can of worms, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like it needs to. The masters now need to be competitive, like especially in loud genres like metal, rock, EDM, especially obviously, and I do think it's important to consider streaming, but I feel like most of the whole master for streaming target speak is overflow from when Spotify like first came out, because originally if your track was too loud, they had a limiter that they would put on it, and it would be limited. And so now at that point, the way your track sounds to the listener, you're at the mercy of like Spotify's random algorithm limiter, which could change your sound. But then they changed it, so now all they're doing is just turning it down. And what that means, and what I tell my clients when they say, well, should I have a master for streaming and a master to hand out to DJs? It's like, no, just do your master the song for what it is. Make it as loud as the tracks you're referencing, so that when you hand it out to a DJ and they put it in their USB to go on the CDJs, like it's competitive and loud. And as long as it still sounds the way you want at that loud volume, it's going to sound exactly the same on Spotify. Just turn down. And who cares? Because they're using the same measurement algorithm for every track. So it's not like it's going to go from yours to somebody else's. And even though yours is turned down, it will be quieter. It's just be turned down to match the quiet ones.
Yeah. I think that's really important, because what you mentioned there about how when Spotify started out and they were using the limiter and then they changed it, I think that's important to realize that, like, if you are going to do it for that particular level for a streaming platform, they could change the goalposts at any point.
Exactly.
And then then your master is not fit for purpose then. So yeah, that's really good, because it's nice. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, I've got this curated series now for mastering, and what the audience hopefully are hearing is just that. You're basically just, it's got to be competitive, and it's just got to be complementary to the music. Don't worry about like what Spotify is going to do to it, because ultimately it's just going to turn it down, and like the same with Apple
right.
and Tidal and whatnot. So yeah, key pieces of information. So with regards to that, we're sort of coming towards the end now. So final words of advice, as we call it, for aspiring producers and artists working in home studios. What's one key piece of advice you would offer to help them elevate their mastering, DIY mastering workflow?
I think the most key piece of advice would just be going back to what we were talking about earlier, which is just to be real with yourself about what it's going to take. Like, to sit there and say, I want to be a mastering engineer. What you're really saying to yourself is, I want to make a bunch of sacrifice because I'm going to have to put a ton of time in my life into learning this and doing thousands of mixes before I even get good. You know what I mean? Like, you have to understand what you're signing up for, because at least for me, once I decided, oh, okay, I want to make a living from music, my own goalposts were always like years too short. You know, it's
Yeah,
like, okay, in 3 years from now, I'll be doing this. And then it's like 3 years and I'm like, man, I'm only this far. Like, what the heck? And then it's like, okay, well, 5 years. And, long story short, it took probably like, to be sitting here talking to you, comfortably doing this for a living, almost 2 decades, like
yeah.
a long time, you know what I mean? And so, and it's also just not fooling yourself that like, there's no magic gear, there's no magic anything. It's literally just your ears. That's it.
Yeah.
And just managing that, because pursuing your passion in a way that can afford you making a living is challenging, and it does take a lot of like mental gymnastics. At least my experience was like, it's hard to turn this into a career. And so if that's really what you want to do, just you'll save yourself a lot of stress and depression and struggle if you can just be honest with yourself at what it's going to take.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You got to put in the reps ultimately, and you got to be prepared to in it for the long haul. Put in the reps, and there will be knockbacks, and there will be moments where you're thinking, actually, is this right? But you just got to keep.
What did I do with my life?
Yeah, it could have been so different. Yeah, exactly. Really, really good stuff. Eric, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. If our audience want to find more about you and what you do, where should we send them?
You can go on Instagram. It's at Eric Mitchell Audio or ericmitchellaudio.com.
Fantastic. Audience, I will put that in the show notes. So please do go follow Eric on Instagram, and also check out the website as well, and learn more about what he is doing, what he's done in the past as well. Really, really good stuff. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad we've been finally been able to chat. It's been a while.
Likewise.
And and I will catch up with you soon.
Awesome, man. Sounds good.
If you've enjoyed this episode, I want to hear from you. Click the link in the episode description. Click the SpeakPipe link and leave me a 30-second audio message. It doesn't have to be 30 seconds, but up to, detailing why you enjoyed this episode and why you would recommend it. And also give yourself a shout out. And as an added bonus, each month I will draw a lucky winner from a virtual hat to win a coffee voucher on me. And if you don't like coffee, just give it to someone else and pretend you gave it to them. So click the link in the episode description, and I cannot wait to hear your episode recommendations.